some words that I've heard media use around this time is anger, and I think you already mentioned grief. So can you help us understand why so many of us are just dealing with, the different steps of grief and what those steps are?
Certainly.
You can outline that.
Yeah, no problem. So, as we're talking about before, and I think a lot of psychotherapists are actually usually helping clients grieve in some way, shape, or form. That often can be a big part of the therapeutic intervention overall. Even pre-pandemic, in people's personal lives, oftentimes grief can be a major part of what brings them to treatment and to therapy, and what may be at the root of a lot of depression and anxiety. And when I say grief, I don't necessarily mean the death of a loved one or friend, but loss, disappointments, missed opportunities, lost expectations. So I think that this pandemic very much is representative of that, representative of, in every way, shape, and form, shifts in one's life that could be considered loss, essentially. And you talked about the steps or stages of grief. Now, normally that's, that popular knowledge, a lot of people know about sort of the 5 stages of grief. And it's important to note that they're not necessarily stepwise stages that everyone goes through in a linear fashion. Historically, there was the psychiatrist who wrote about these stages of grief. What I've read is that she really meant it more sort of, these are observations essentially, that she observed people who were actually had terminal illness and their loved ones. She was observing them to sort of go through these different variation in emotion, so to speak. So it was really a way to frame it. So I say that to say that the grieving process is not necessarily a stepwise or stage process, as much as people might recognize certain feelings and emotions that very much are associated with grief and loss. So you mentioned anger, of course, sadness, that is associated with depression oftentimes. So a feeling of helplessness, a feeling of hopelessness, feeling overwhelmed, denial. So I think, initially, even personally for me, I definitely, the first couple of weeks was very much holding on to this almost fantasy that the virus would somehow magically disappear within the next couple of weeks. I mean, I remember waiting for sort of an authority figure, so to speak, to let us know that everything was okay and that we could go resume life as normal. And of course, as time went on, we learned that that is not the case. So, sort of me kind of experiencing my own sort of denial, so to speak, or not wanting to believe that COVID was as serious as it was. Confusion, shock, fear, all is associated with denial. And then, the psychiatrist who came up with these stages of grief talks about bargaining. And what she meant by that is, struggling to find meaning. So basically, where you're a sense of hopelessness or helplessness, where it's hard to even understand, what can I get out of this, essentially, apart from feeling as though I'm suffering. And then eventually, in her model, in her frame, she talks about acceptance, which is where we kind of come to a certain peace about what's happening. So it's not necessarily you sort of collapsing and feeling apathetic about it, but you coming to a sense of understanding, the realization that this is real, and so how can I respond to this? While holding on to a sense of life that maybe you experienced prior to COVID, or maybe you experienced prior to the loss, whatever that loss may be. There is another researcher by the name of Bonanno. He is out of Colombia, and he's written a lot in recent times about grief and loss. He wrote a lot about people's reactions to 9/11 and a lot of case studies of people who've experienced traumatic loss. And he found in his research that actually the stages of grief are one way to frame it. He actually found that we're actually hardwired, and this is maybe kind of the more hopeful end of things, is that we're hardwired to cope with loss, because death is a very natural part of human life. You know, as sad as it may be for us, it is a natural part of human life. So we are hardwired to cope with it. And he was saying in his research, he found that when people have a sudden loss, oftentimes what can be surprising and hopeful is sort of a certain found resilience, essentially, and the human capacity for resilience, which I think is something to hold on to, which is the fact that even though this is an extremely difficult time where a lot of real fear, you know, comes to the fore and we're experiencing a lot of loss, you know, we have it within us, so to speak, organically to weather it. Now, of course, we could always use guidance, you know, in that department, but nonetheless, his research found that, you know, humans do have very much a natural capacity to cope with loss and difficult times.